Hello, this is the World of the 20th Century podcast, and I'm your professor, Adam Pohl. History.
Lesson 5, Chapter 12, Africa, from Independence to Dependency. Chapter 12 discusses developments in Africa from the 1960s to the 1980s. For many of the same reasons for decolonization in Asia, such as the collapse of the will or ability of European imperial powers to maintain their overseas colonies, as well as the challenge of containing growing nationalist movements, African nations gradually gained their independence from the 1950s up to 1990. As can be seen by the map on page 319 in the text, which gives the dates of independence for each African nation, clearly the years 1960 to 1966 mark the great wave of African independence. Thus, Africa was the last region in the world to be liberated from European colonial domination. The chapter's subtitle, From Independence to Dependency, points to the general trend on the continent from the 1960s to the 1980s. After a great wave of independence movements during the 1950s and 1960s, African nations chartered their own paths, trying to enjoy the fruits of independence. However, because of the colonial legacies, economic underdevelopment, and inability of former colonial powers such as Britain and France to relinquish their influence, Africa lost its independent streak and again became more dependent on Western influence, and eventually became embroiled in the Cold War rivalry between the USA and the USSR, something most African nations had sought to avoid during the 1960s. Africa, of course, is a massive continent with over 24 countries. Several different European powers, such as Britain, France, Portugal, and Belgium, had colonial possessions throughout. Thus, it is not surprising to note that there were a variety of ways in which independence was achieved. In some countries, independence was freely granted. In others, it had to be wrested from the clenched hands of the imperial power through bloody guerrilla war. One clear point that can be made about independence movements in Africa after World War II is that where there were well-entrenched communities of European white settlers, such as in French-controlled Algeria or British-controlled Kenya, the imperial power was less likely to give up the colony without facing violent confrontation. In both Algeria and Kenya, the white settlers had privileged economic, social, and political positions within the country and were loath to give them up. In Algeria, the European colonists were known as colons. These settlers represented about 10% of the population in Algeria, but dominated the political and economic life. They were determined to prevent Algeria becoming independent from France. Consequently, Algerian independence was achieved through a bloody war led by the National Liberation Front. Significantly, it was the World War II hero, Charles de Gaulle, who took the political decision to end the war. Returning to power in 1958, he argued that France could not win the struggle to maintain Algeria as a colony, and so began long negotiations and continuing fighting until independence was achieved in 1962. Another general point that can be made about the decolonization process is that different European imperial powers had different attitudes to their African possessions. Portugal, whose place as a world power had been declining for centuries, was loath to give up the last vestiges of its once great empire. Consequently, Portugal refused to even grant greater autonomy to Mozambique and Angola. Following a decade of war, the two African nations won their independence in the early 1960s. In Canada, we of course know about the British Commonwealth. However, this association for former colonies was not unique. France had its own association, called the French Community. France, under de Gaulle, was keenly aware of the clamoring for greater autonomy and outright independence of its colonies. De Gaulle proposed a transition period for its African colonies, a period of extensive self-government coupled with French aid in the form of financial aid and military and economic advisors. If the African nation turned down the aid and participation in the French community, it would gain immediate independence but no help from the French. Unlike most of the other European imperial powers, France sought to maintain close economic and cultural ties with its former colonies. The experiences of another nation, Nigeria, point to some of the growing pains for newly independent countries. Most countries are artificial creations. When they are island nations, they can be relatively homogeneous. When they are created by imperial powers, they often meld together groups of people with as much differences as similarities. The British, for example, did this in India with Muslims and Hindus, as well as in Iraq with Sunni and Shia Muslims, Christians and Kurds. In Nigeria, the British sought to overcome the ethnic and cultural heterogeneity through the creation of a federal system that would give equal rights to the three main ethnic groups, the Yorubas in the west, the Hausa in the north, and the Igbo in the south. Tensions quickly erupted following Nigerian independence in 1960, when the largely Christian Igbos attempted to secede from the Federation and form their own nation called Biafra. This led to a 3-year civil war of violence and extreme hardship. The example of South Africa poses a different kind of case. South Africa obtained full independence from Britain in 1931, but still had a colonial-type society in its apartheid system. The descendants of early Dutch settlers, called Afrikaners, were an extremely conservative group who dominated South African society. A tiny minority who restricted the rights, freedom of movement, civil liberties, and so on of the African majority. The repressive apartheid system spurred a resistance movement led by the African National Congress. Interestingly, the resistance movement had many of the hallmarks of a nationalist movement, a dominant, persecuted African group fighting a colonial-like minority-dominated state, which was technically independent from the European imperial nation Britain, but which largely resembled a colonial state. As African states took their independence in the 1950s and 1960s, there grew a movement for greater cooperation and integration of African nations. The primary organization which sought to achieve this was the Organization of African Unity, established in 1963, and which had 3 main objectives. The first was to prevent conflicts over borders and maintain the territorial integrity of African states. The second was a lofty goal of African political unification of the continent. Bear in mind that after World War II, Europe was also moving towards greater economic and political integration, which culminated in the establishment of the European Union. In the African movement, it was not clearly articulated how this goal of political unity would be achieved or what it would actually look like. Nevertheless, the goal illustrated a desire for cooperation for the newly independent nations on the continent, nations which were poor, had few democratic traditions, had multi-ethnic populations, and which also had great natural resources, were very underdeveloped, and lacked capital investment or the access to markets. The third goal was to remain neutral in the politics of the Cold War. As the text discusses, economic development was a key element in modernizing and stabilizing newly independent African states. This was no easy task, given the colonial legacies from European domination and the chronic underdevelopment of most African nations. Several of the European powers, such as France and Britain, which had dominated Africa for decades, retained their imperial attitudes to their former colonies, and maintained indirect control of the African states through economic, political, and military influence. This has been called neoliberalism. Take, for example, the Anglo-Nigerian Pact of 1960 between Britain and Nigeria. This agreement gave Britain certain rights over its former colony, such as the right for Britain to militarily intervene in Nigerian affairs, the right for Britain to maintain military bases on Nigerian soil, and the right to use Nigerian airspace during an emergency. Was Nigeria really a fully independent nation if it allowed its former colonial ruler to have these rights? Was Nigeria fully sovereign? Over time, Britain reduced her security commitments to Africa, and instead, power over African states came in the form of British-based companies, corporations, and financial institutions that had tremendous power and influence. Generally, France exerted much more direct control over its former colonies than did Britain. France established mutual defense pacts with many of its former colonies in Africa, which allowed France the power of military intervention. France had around 10,000 troops in Africa during the mid-1960s, and her military forces were used in several countries during the 1960s. Again, the fact that the former colonial power had the right to send in troops to fix problems as it saw fit, to prop up one government or overthrow another, does this seem like the African states had full control over their own destinies? These were examples of neo-imperialism, that is, the reassertion of control from an outside country. Against the determined efforts of African leaders, by the mid-1970s the Cold War rivalries had extended to Africa, as both the USSR and the USA sought allies on the continent. As noted in the text, one of the first developments was a deal between the East African state of Somalia and the Soviet Union in 1974. By the end of the 1970s, it was clear that the OAU's goal of an African continent neutral during the Cold War had failed. For their own reasons, African states began choosing sides with either the USA or the USSR, often for defensive reasons and economic development and investment. Thus, the dependence on outside powers had actually increased by the 1970s and 1980s, after the wave of independence during the 1950s and the 1960s.